The silence of the tatami room was heavy. A wife knelt with her forehead pressed to the floor, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She had not raised her voice. She had not run away. Her crime was subtler, quieter, suspicion of betrayal, dishonor to her husband's name. Outside, the cicadas screamed in the heat of a summer afternoon, but inside, death lingered like incense. For the wives of samurai, the punishment for dishonor was not swift execution at the edge of a sword. It was something far more intimate, far more devastating. It was death demanded by her own hand. This is not the Japan of noble duels and cherry blossoms. This is the world of blood oaths, ritual shame, and silent screams behind sliding paper doors. Stay with me because what you're about to hear is a story that history books soften, but reality never forgave. If stories of hidden histories and the untold tragedies of the past compel you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Join us as we step inside the walls of the samurai household where honor was worth more than breath, and where a wife's fate was sealed not by outsiders but by the very code her husband lived and died for. Chapter 1. The Silent Household. The samurai household was not built only on stone and timber. It was built on silence. Silence that weighed heavier than walls, silence that pressed down upon every breath a wife took. From the outside, these homes looked like havens of order, sliding paper doors, carefully tended gardens, the fragrance of pine and incense drifting through the air. But inside, every step was measured, every word was weighed. A single misstep, even one born of innocence, could ripple into disaster. For the wife of a samurai, her body was not her own. Her life was a reflection of her husband's honor, his name, his reputation. When he left the house to serve his lord, she became both caretaker and shadow, responsible for ensuring that no blemish, no whisper of impropriety ever stained his standing. If her husband died in battle, she was expected to carry herself with a dignity that matched his sacrifice. If he lived, she had to preserve the household as if she were nothing more than an extension of his will. Love, if it existed, was tangled in duty. Some marriages were arranged when the bride was little more than a girl, her childhood traded for the weight of her husband's clan. She was taught from the start, speak softly, move quietly, obey quickly. Her education was not in poetry or song, though some learned them. It was an etiquette in how to bow, how to prepare meals, how to keep her gaze lowered before guests. More importantly, it was in restraint, how not to speak too freely, how not to reveal too much, how not to laugh too loud. Imagine the air in such a home, the muted footsteps on tatami mats, the faint clatter of porcelain cups, the rustle of silk as a wife knelt to serve tea, her sleeves falling like curtains over trembling hands. There was beauty in this stillness, but also suffocation. Every movement was a reminder of the invisible code that bound her. Do not shame your husband. Do not bring dishonor upon this house. The unspoken threat lingered like a blade at the back of the neck. She knew what had happened to other women, perhaps whispered among the servants, perhaps relayed in cautionary tales told by her mother before marriage. She knew that a careless glance at a messenger, a rumor of impropriety, a failure to perform her duties with exact precision could brand her as unfaithful, unworthy, or dishonorable. And dishonor had only one cure, but still life went. Chapter 2. The shadow of suspicion. Suspicion in a samurai household was like smoke. It did not arrive with a shout, nor with the clang of a blade. It drifted quietly, creeping under doors, seeping through paper walls, curling itself around those it wished to suffocate. For a samurai wife, suspicion was not merely dangerous, it was fatal. In Japan's feudal world, reputation was the sharpest weapon. A man's honor was more fragile than the porcelain cups from which he drank his tea, and infinitely more precious. The samurai's loyalty to his lord, his discipline in combat, his dignity in death, all of these could be undone by a whisper that his wife had failed him. Even if the whisper was false, even if it was born in malice or envy. To ignore it would be to risk disgrace. To act upon it was to prove strength. So suspicion became a silent trial, one that did not require witnesses or evidence. A glance too long at a passing retainer, a servant's report of a smile exchanged at the market, a husband's unease when he returned home to find his wife's eyes lowered too slowly. These moments could be strung together into a chain, and that chain could drag her to her death. There was no defense. To protest innocence was to invite doubt. To cry out against the injustice was to betray weakness. A wife knew this. She learned it early. That is why, when the first shadow of suspicion fell upon her, she did not plead. She grew quieter. She bowed lower. She prayed longer. For she knew that the more she tried to fight it, the deeper it would burrow. And yet, silence was rarely enough. Suspicion, once planted, grew like weeds in a garden. A neighbor might recall seeing her at a shrine without her husband. A cousin might wonder aloud at the gifts she sent her family. A servant might misinterpret a single word. These fragments wove themselves into a net. And once the net was drawn, no woman escaped. The cruelty of it lay in its swiftness. A husband might not confront his wife directly. Instead, he would retreat into his own silence, watching her every move with cold detachment. Nights became colder. Meals eaten in silence. Servants avoided her gaze, having already chosen where their loyalty lay. The walls closed in, and she knew, though no one spoke it, that she was already condemned. Sometimes the shadow came not from the husband, but from the world beyond the home. Rivals of her clan might spread rumors, knowing that destroying the wife meant weakening the husband's standing. A jealous concubine might whisper lies. A disgraced retainer might seek revenge. Women lived not only under the judgment of their own household, but under the merciless scrutiny of the entire samurai class. For the wife, the most bitter truth was this: innocence offered no shield. The purity of her heart, the devotion of her service, the loyalty of her body, none of it mattered if dishonor was spoken aloud. Suspicion had its own gravity. Once it fell, it dragged her toward one fate. We must imagine the weight of those days when suspicion first took root. A wife kneeling at the family altar, her lips moving in silent prayer, while in her chest her heart thundered. A husband passing her in the hall without a word, his eyes colder than steel. The servants whispering in corners, falling silent when she entered. The children too young to understand, watching their mother with puzzled fear. This was not the sudden drama of the battlefield. It was slower, more suffocating. Death approached not with a shout, but with a whisper. And she knew it, she could feel it in the quiet. She could feel it in the air itself, heavy with judgment. When the husband finally acted, it was often without explanation. A summons to the inner room, a request spoken with formal detachment. A dagger laid before her, the words were rarely needed. She understood them before they were spoken. Suspicion had reached its end. And now her silence would demand its price. Suspicion was not always a thunderclap. Sometimes it was a whisper that stretched over weeks, even months, until the wife herself began to feel as though the shadow had become part of her body. She would wake with it, carry it through her day, lay it beside her on her futon at night. To live in suspicion was to live half dead already. There are chronicles, faded with time, that speak of wives accused not by direct acts but by the cruel machinery of circumstance. One woman, it is said, was condemned after a retainer swore he saw her slip a letter beneath a gate to a stranger. The letter was never found. The stranger was never named, but the rumor grew teeth. To allow it to fester unchecked would have humiliated her husband before his peers. And so, her end was sealed by words she never spoke, by a gesture she never made. Another tale, whispered among Edo period writers, tells of a wife who was suspected not of infidelity, but of disobedience. She had hidden coins from the household allowance, saving them secretly for her family in the countryside. To her, it was love. To her husband, it was betrayal. A samurai's house was not her own, its wealth not hers to touch. When the coins were discovered, shame burned hotter than reason, and shame demanded blood. This was the cruelty of suspicion, its flexibility. It did not bind itself only to affairs of the heart, but to anything that might be construed as disloyalty. A wife who visited a shrine often might be accused of seeking guidance from another man's spirit. A wife who laughed too freely in the presence of guests might be branded unchaste. Even illness could be turned against her. A sickly wife was seen as a weakness, and weakness brought dishonor. The power of suspicion lay in its invisibility. Evidence was not needed. Truth was not required. The accusation itself carried the weight of inevitability. Because in a world where honor was the bedrock of survival, to question the accuser was to risk even greater dishonor. A husband could not be seen as blind or indulgent. To forgive might invite ridicule from other warriors, marking him as weak. And weakness was as fatal to a samurai as cowardice in battle. So the wife became the sacrifice to protect the husband's name. Her death was not framed as cruelty, but as necessity, as though the house itself required her blood to wash away the stain. There was a certain hypocrisy in this, but it was one carefully hidden beneath ritual and tradition. To outsiders, the death of a dishonored wife preserved dignity. Within the walls, it silenced the shame. We must imagine the moment when suspicion became command. A husband, stone-faced, might call his wife into the inner chamber. The room would be bare, save for a low lamp casting shadows along the tatami mats. On the floor before her, a dagger. Perhaps it was wrapped in silk, as if to soften the brutality of its demand. Perhaps not. The words spoken varied little across time. They were not cruel, nor tender, but hollow. Asterisk, it must be done. Asterisk, that was enough. She understood. No defense was expected. No denial could change the course. To resist would only bring humiliation upon her family, a spectacle too shameful to endure. Better to obey, to carry out the act with quiet submission, than to risk dragging others into disgrace. This was how suspicion transformed into inevitability. It was not law. It was not even custom written in scrolls. It was pressure, the unbearable pressure of honor. A code that demanded men die by their own swords when shamed, and women follow them into death when accused. What made it most tragic was that the wife, more often than not, accepted this fate. She had been raised too. From girlhood, she knew dishonor had only one ending. Her mother may have whispered it to her on the night before marriage. Asterisk, if you are accused, you must die with dignity. Asterisk, it was less instruction than prophecy. And when the prophecy arrived, she was expected to fulfill it. And so the wife who had once bowed, who had once prayed, who had once played with her children in the garden, now knelt before the dagger laid upon the tatami. Suspicion had found her, had swallowed her whole, now only silence remained. But her death, as we shall see, was not like that of her husband's. The samurai who took his life in seppuku sought to display courage, to face agony as proof of his resolve. The wife was not asked to show courage, she was asked to show modesty, obedience, silence. Even in her final act, she was bound by rules that stripped her of voice. And it is here, in the stillness of the inner chamber, that suspicion gave way to the ritual of jigai. The wife's own hand turned against herself. Chapter 3. Jigai. Death by her own hand. The room was quiet. To quiet, the kind of quiet that does not soothe but suffocates. A lamp flickered in the corner, its light trembling against the paper walls. A wife knelt upon the tatami, her legs folded neatly beneath her, her back straight. Before her lay a dagger. Its blade was short, its handle wrapped in cord. To most, it would appear an object of utility, but in this moment, it was a sentence. This act had a name, jigai. It was the counterpart to the seppuku of men. But where the samurai's ritual was framed as an act of courage, a wife's was framed as necessity, as preservation of honor. It was not a choice freely given, it was an order dressed in silence. And it demanded precision not only in action, but in appearance. Before the final act, there were preparations. The wife would often bind her legs together at the knees, sometimes with a strip of silk, sometimes with the cord of her own garment. This was not superstition, it was modesty. By binding her legs, she ensured that even in death her body would remain composed, her dignity preserved. The samurai's code reached even here. Her blood might flow, her breath might cease, but her form must remain proper. Imagine her hands trembling as she tied the knot. Imagine the thought that accompanied it, not of survival, for survival was already denied, but of how she would be seen after she fell. Even in her final moment, she was expected to serve. The dagger itself was often prepared in advance, hidden within the household, ready for the day it would be required. Some accounts speak of women carrying small blades within their sleeves when traveling, a constant reminder that death was never far. The blade was not large, not designed for battle. It was designed for intimacy. It was designed to be turned against one's own body. The act was swift yet unbearable. Unlike seppuku, which involved disembowelment, jigai required a sharp slash to the throat. It was quicker, less prolonged, but no less horrific. With one motion, she was expected to cut through the flesh of her own neck, silencing her breath, staining her robe in crimson. It was not done in front of cheering onlookers, nor in the company of peers. It was done in isolation within the quiet prison of her own home, and yet witnesses were never far. A servant might linger outside the room, ears straining for the silence that would follow the act. A husband, waiting in another chamber, might listen for the thud of her body against the floor. Sometimes an elder woman of the household would be present, not to comfort, but to ensure the deed was carried out correctly. There was no mercy in this watchfulness, only duty. The smell of incense often hung in the air, burning to mask the scent of blood. The crackle of the lamp might be the last sound she heard, the final mark of life slipping into shadow. When her body collapsed, her legs bound neatly, her throat cut, she became more than a woman. She became a message, a warning to others, an emblem of how honor devoured even the innocent. In that moment, the tragedy was complete. She had fulfilled her role to the end. She had carried the silence of the household into the silence of death. And yet, the horror lingered, for this was not a death chosen in freedom. It was a death demanded by a code written for men, imposed upon women, and executed in the stillness of domestic walls. The image is haunting: a wife, her robes stained dark, her body folded neatly, her face pale in the glow of the lamp. Outside, the world went on. Cicadas still screamed in the summer air. Children still played in the streets. Festivals still lit lanterns against the night. But inside that home, silence had claimed another victim. What is most chilling is how ordinary this ritual became. It was not shouted about, not carved into the official chronicles of war and conquest. It was whispered, passed along in hushed tones, remembered by servants and daughters, retold as warnings. It was not spectacle, it was routine. And therein lay its terror. For while seppuku etched itself into the memory of Japan as a symbol of honor, jigai remained hidden in the folds of domestic life. Too shameful to be glorified, too intimate to be celebrated, but never absent. Always waiting, a shadow that hovered over every wife, reminding her that her life was not her own. Jigari was not only an act of death, it was an act of erasure. It erased the woman's voice, her innocence, her story. History remembered the husband, his honor preserved, his clan unsullied. But the wife, she became a footnote, a body disposed of with dignity, her name often forgotten. And yet, if we listen closely to these whispers, we can still hear her. The hush of her final breath, the snap of silk binding her legs, the scrape of steel against her throat, the silence after. This is her story, buried in shadows, waiting to be told. But death by her own hand was not the end of her presence. For in the wake of jigai, the house itself bore the weight of her absence. And sometimes her silence did not remain silent. Sometimes it returned as a voice, as a presence, as a ghost. The act of jigari was rarely spoken of openly, but its shadow stretched long over the women of samurai households. It was whispered in lullabies sung by mothers to daughters, woven into lessons disguised as caution. A girl did not grow up imagining her wedding night as the beginning of a new life. She grew up knowing that her marriage bound her not only to a husband but to his honor, and that honor might one day demand her blood. One recorded account tells of a wife in Kyoto during the early Edo period. Her husband, a mid-ranking samurai, had been accused of cowardice in battle. Though he survived, the shame clung to him like a stain. Desperate to erase it, he turned upon his wife, insisting she end her life to cleanse the dishonor from their house. There was no accusation of infidelity, no whisper of betrayal. Her crime was simply being his wife when his name had fallen. And so, she bound her legs with a strip of red silk, knelt before the household shrine, and drew the blade across her own throat. Neighbors said the incense from her altar drifted for days afterward, heavy and bitter, as if the gods themselves mourned. Another tale tells of a woman married into a powerful clan. She was accused of exchanging secret messages with her brother, who served a rival lord. Whether those messages carried information of value, no one could say. Some claimed they were only letters of affection, reminders of childhood. But suspicion does not require proof. The accusation alone was enough. And so she was summoned to the inner room, her children kept away, her servants trembling as they listened outside. When the silence finally fell, one maid swore she heard the sound of silk snapping taut before the dagger fell. It was the sound of her legs being bound, ensuring her death would be remembered as dignified, not disheveled. These stories were not rare. They were the fabric of life, the quiet horrors that women carried in their bones. Even those who never faced the dagger lived with its promise. Some women, traveling long distances, carried small blades tucked into their sleeves or obi. These were not weapons to ward off attackers. They were promises that if dishonor ever found them, they would not return home alive. Imagine the weight of that knowledge, the cold press of metal against the skin, every step a reminder that death was expected to be near. The ritual itself bore the cruelty of restraint. Jiguri was considered cleaner than seppuku, less disruptive, less public. But in truth, it was no less savage. The cut across the throat was decisive, severing both voice and breath. The wife who performed it was expected to do so swiftly, without struggle, her face composed, her body still. There was no honor in a messy death. Even agony had to be hidden, suppressed, polished into obedience, and then there was the aftermath. Servants would move quickly, cleaning the tatami mats, replacing the lamp, folding the blood-stained garments into silence. The body would be prepared with care. Dressed in formal robes, the bound legs a final testament to her modesty. The children were often told only fragments of the truth, that their mother had fallen ill, that she had gone to the gods. But they too had ears, and whispers carried through walls. Many grew up knowing the reality, carrying it like an invisible scar into their own marriages. What makes these stories most unbearable is the acceptance that surrounded them. Jiguri was not seen as murder. It was seen as duty. Neighbors might whisper in sympathy, but rarely in outrage. Families might mourn in private, but they did not protest. Even other wives, watching from behind their own paper walls, understood that this was the fate that awaited them if suspicion ever came. It was not questioned, it was endured, and yet, endurance does not erase the human cost. Imagine the fear in those final moments, the shallow breaths, the trembling hands, the bitter taste of incense on the tongue. Imagine the loneliness, the knowledge that no one would step forward to save her, that even her own family would accept her death as necessity. This was not simply ritual, it was abandonment. But if the living accepted it in silence, the dead did not always rest quietly. Stories began to circulate of women who lingered after death, their spirits bound to the homes where they had been forced to die. Servants swore they heard footsteps in empty corridors, whispers in the night, the rustle of silk behind closed doors. Some claimed to see pale figures kneeling in the corners of rooms, faces veiled in blood. These tales became warnings not only of dishonor but of vengeance. For a woman denied her voice in life might claim it in death. Jiguri was not just a personal tragedy. It was a wound carried by every household that demanded it, a stain that incense and ritual could never fully cleanse. And though history rarely spoke their names, the silence of these women seeped into the walls, the gardens, the very air of samurai life. It was a silence that did not end with their breath. It lingered, heavy and unrelenting, shaping the memory of generations. And in those memories, in those whispers, a transformation began. For the wife who died by her own hand was not simply gone. She became something else, a presence, a warning, a ghost. Chapter 4. The House of Ghosts. The walls of a samurai home could not contain what had been done within them. Death, when forced, leaves more than silence, it leaves shadows. And in the centuries that followed, Japan became thick people with tales of. Fell sick until the spirit was appeased through ritual. These stories blurred the line between moral instruction and supernatural terror, binding women's silence in life with power in death. The haunting image of the Onryu, the vengeful female ghost, became one of the most enduring archetypes in Japanese storytelling. It was not coincidence that so many of these figures were women. Men died loudly on the battlefield, their deaths recorded in chronicles and sung in ballads. Women died quietly in their homes, their deaths smothered in silence. But silence breeds shadows, and shadows breed fear. To this day, the figure of the pale, long-haired woman remains a central image in Japanese horror, from Edo-era ghost stories to modern cinema. Each one echoes the wives who died unseen, reminding us that their silence was never truly complete. Yet beyond fear, there was also memory. Literature of the Edo period sometimes portrayed these women with sympathy, even reverence. Poets wrote of the fragrance of incense lingering after their deaths, of the sorrow that seeped through gardens where they once walked. Some Buddhist monks recorded accounts of wives forced into jigai, framing them as martyrs of honor, their deaths a tragic mirror of the samurai's seppuku. Though these writings were often brief, they revealed a crack in the facade, a recognition that what society demanded was cruelty, that the blood spilled in silence was no less sacred than the blood spilled in battle. But not all remembered them with pity. For many men of the warrior class, these tales hardened into tools of discipline. A father might point to such stories when warning his daughter on the eve of marriage. Remember your duty. Remember what happens when suspicion falls. In this way, the ghost stories reinforced the very code that created them, weaving fear into obedience. Even in memory, the women were bent into instruments of control. Still, there were those who whispered differently. Among women themselves, these tales became a secret kind of solidarity. Mothers and grandmothers spoke of the ghosts not as terrors, but as companions. They reminded their daughters that if dishonor ever came, if silence was forced upon them, they would not be forgotten. Their voices would return, if not in life, then in the trembling of paper doors at night, in the chill of a darkened corridor. For in a world where women had little agency, the belief in their lingering presence gave them, at last, a kind of power. And perhaps it is here that we glimpse the true weight of these hauntings. They were not only punishments for the living, nor warnings for the disobedient. They were also acts of remembrance, a way of inscribing the suffering of wives into the collective memory of a people who might otherwise have buried them entirely. Through ghosts, the wives lived on. Through whispers, they refused erasure. Even today, when we look at Japanese art and literature, we find traces of them. The painted scrolls of ****, ghostly women in white, stare back at us with eyes clouded in sorrow. The plays of kabuki and bunraku still carry their voices, and in the quiet halls of museums, wood block prints show their pale forms drifting like mist across paper, bound forever to the silence that once consumed them. The House of Ghosts was not just a single household. It was Japan itself, haunted by the thousands of women who died unseen, unheard, unnamed. Their legacy was not carved in stone, but in shadows. Not written in chronicles, but in whispers. And those whispers, carried across centuries, still demand to be heard. But history does not stop with haunting. The echoes of these women's deaths shaped how Japan remembered honor, gender, and silence itself. Their legacy, both tragic and enduring, stretches far beyond ghost stories. It shaped the very soul of a nation. The story of Jiguli does not end in the dimly lit rooms where women bound their legs and drew the blade across their throats. It stretches beyond blood-stained tatami mats, beyond incense smoke and hushed whispers. It lingers in the way a culture remembers, the way a society teaches its children, the way silence itself becomes tradition. The legacy of Jigai is not only the death of women, it is the enduring presence of absence. In the centuries that followed, the samurai class faded. Swords were banned, castles dismantled, the shogunate toppled by the march of modernity. Yet even as Japan stepped into a new age, the memory of honor and its demands remained etched into its identity. Men still celebrated seppuku as a symbol of courage, discipline, and loyalty. Plays, novels, and films elevated it into myth. But Jigai, the ritual of women, rarely found such glory. It remained half-hidden, spoken of in whispers, remembered more as a caution than a celebration. Why? Because Jigai revealed a truth that the samurai class preferred not to face. Seppuku could be framed as noble because it was voluntary, at least in appearance. Jigai, however, exposed the harsh imbalance between men and women, the cruelty of a code that demanded silence not only in life but in death. To glorify it would be to acknowledge its injustice. And so, society buried it beneath layers of silence, much as the women themselves had been buried in life. Yet silence does not erase memory, it distorts it. Jigai became a ghost not only in households but in history itself. When Western scholars first encountered the stories, they often recoiled, struggling to reconcile the romanticized image of the samurai with the brutal fate of their wives. Some dismissed the practice as rumor or exaggeration. Others sensationalized it, painting lurid pictures of women's suicides to titillate readers. Rarely was it understood for what it was, a tragedy woven into the fabric of a code that valued reputation above humanity. Still, traces of the wives endured. In folklore, they became spirits who refused to remain silent. In theater, they became symbols of injustice and vengeance. In art, they became pale figures hovering at the edge of memory. And in the private conversations of women, in the quiet exchanges between mothers and daughters, they became warnings and companions. Jigai's legacy was not uniform. It was fractured, contested, shifting depending on who told the story and why. For some, it reinforced the necessity of obedience. See what happens when honor is questioned, fathers would say. For others, it was a quiet form of rebellion. Even in silence, women return, mothers whispered. The same act that once erased women became, in memory, a source of presence. In modern Japan, the image of the silent, vengeful woman still dominates horror stories and cinema. The archetype of the ghostly wife, pale, long-haired, silent until her scream tears through the night, echoes directly from the wives who died in silence centuries ago. Audiences may not always recognize the origin, but the shadow of Jigai is there, woven into the cultural imagination. What was once hidden has become spectacle, a reminder that even the most buried truths claw their way back to the surface. But perhaps the deepest legacy is philosophical. Jiguli forces us to ask questions that extend beyond the walls of the samurai home. What is honor when it demands blood from the innocent? What is loyalty when it silences the voice of the powerless? And what does it mean to preserve dignity if dignity is purchased at the cost of life itself? These questions haunted Japan, even if they were rarely spoken aloud. They linger still, for Jigai is not just a relic of the past. It is a mirror that reflects how societies, across cultures and centuries, have demanded silence from women, have equated obedience with virtue, have written codes that preserve the reputation of men at the expense of the lives of women. And yet, in telling these stories now, we break that silence. We remember the women not as shadows, not as whispers, but as lives that mattered, lives that deserved more than a dagger and a bound pair of legs. To speak of Jigai is to give them back their voice, however belatedly. The samurai code exalted honor above all else, but history reminds us that honor, pursued without compassion, becomes cruelty. That silence enforced too long becomes haunting. And that even the smallest whispers, the rustle of silk in a quiet room, the sigh of a forgotten wife, can echo louder than the clash of swords. This is the legacy of silence, not only in Japan, but everywhere silence has been demanded of the powerless. It is a legacy that warns us, beware the codes that exalt reputation above life, beware the traditions that value obedience above truth. For they may seem uncheckable, but they always leave ghosts behind, and those ghosts will not be silenced. The silence of the wives who died by Jigai was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of absence that lingers like a wound. An absence at the family altar, an empty place at the meal, a mother's arms no longer there too.